Welcome to 10-Minute Type Advice by Personality Hacker. I'm Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
This show features questions from the Personality Hacker community that we answer in about 10 minutes. We've been using personality types in our coaching for years, and we'd love to answer your questions about personal growth through the lens of type. You can find out more about us at personalityhacker.com. Okay, now let's hear today's question.
Hello. So to summarize, I'm a female INTP and INFP. I always test right down the middle, 49 to 51% split on that third letter. I think my main trouble with those assessments is answering based on what I do in my professional life or my personal life. As you know, we spend a lot of our time at work. At the same time, I never know how to answer questions like that. So let's say I were to be asked, when something comes up that I very strongly disagree with, do I speak my mind about it? In my personal life, absolutely yes. In my professional life, where there are authority figures whom I, for various reasons, have fears of, no, I do not and would not. I would most definitely keep my mouth shut. But in my personal life, you couldn't get me to keep my mouth shut on the things that I care about. So I'm having a lot of trouble. How do you answer questions like that? Do you lean towards how you act in your professional life, or do you just stick to how you act in your personal life?
Thank you, Carly, for the question. So when I'm taking an assessment, when I'm trying to understand my personality, I'm being asked about myself. Your question is, which one do I answer? Do I answer my professional life? Because that's a very different way of going about life. Or do I answer how I would be in my personal life? Because those two worlds are different for me. And depending on what you're actually asking, I'm going to answer those assessment questions differently.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the reasons why forced choice questions are so difficult to use as a type indicator. Now, that's not to say that you can't find your best fit type through an assessment. And I would say that, some assessments like the MBTI instrument, those have actually a very high accuracy rate. Now, of course, they are over 100 questions and they require a facilitator. So the formality of that helps. But for most assessments, and especially online tests, the accuracy is not that great. And it's important to know that for the most part, if you're going to try to find your best fit type through online assessments, and that includes, of course, our own, like all of them, that I always see it as a starting point. Now, I've heard this a lot, this idea of like, well, I'm really close on the line here. I'm 49% one side, 51% the other side, and particularly here when you talk about that third letter of thinking and feeling. Well, there's a couple different things in here that need to be taken into consideration. The first one is that for an INP type, whether you're a feeler or a thinker is critical, because that's going to be your dominant, or what we call your driver cognitive function in the CAR model, meaning that it's not just a part of your personality, it's like a key characteristic of your personality. If you're an INTP, you're using introverted thinking, or what we call accuracy, as your dominant or driver function. And if you're an INFP, you're using introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity, as your dominant or driver function. And this is going to be an enormous part of your personality. Now, it's also going to be something that is the place of highest certainty. It's going to be the place of the most almost like a shrugging nature about life. Like, isn't everybody like this? Doesn't everybody operate this way? And so sometimes it's hard to see those preferences inside of ourselves because it is so much a part of our experience. But I would say as an INP type, you're not going to be almost 50-50 on the third letter. You're definitively a thinker or definitively a feeler. And the other side of that polarity, or what some people call axis, the other side of that is the thinking or feeling preference, which means that you're either going to be a thinker or feeler dominant, and then the opposite is going to be your 3-year-old or inferior function. And so this is a big key component of your personality type. It creates actually the spine of your personality. So knowing which of the two you are is pretty critical.
Typically, when this happens for somebody like yourself, Carly, there might be either a misalignment or misunderstanding of the thinking and feeling itself. Like as a feeler, for years, I would test as a thinker because I would answer questions very thinker heavy. I didn't want to be seen as one of those dumb feelers that didn't know anything, right? And understanding type and the nuances of type, understand, wait, no, that's not a deficiency to be a feeler. It's okay to be a feeler, and there's a lot of intelligence that comes with us feelers.
Well, and it actually has nothing to do with being intelligent.
Correct.
Right. Like there are plenty of very intelligent feelers, and there's some suspiciously unintelligent thinkers out there. So it doesn't really have to do with those kinds of criteria. I do think that we have a tendency to sort of project that stereotype onto it, but I think it's important to know that it has nothing to do with, say, IQ necessarily. That said, there's a piece in here. You mentioned the professional versus the personal, and there is an idea that we become more one-sided. There's a concept called one-sidedness in typology. And that is when our context, our professional context and our home context, and basically everywhere we go, suits our dominant driver and auxiliary co-pilot functions, meaning that we're allowed to stay in our strengths all the time. And there are benefits to that, but there's also drawbacks, which is that we become, like I mentioned, one-sided. We're way too weighted over on, just these components of our personality. When our professional context, our career, or other areas in our life force us out of those parts of ourselves, then there's a balance that ends up happening. We become less one-sided. We can visit the other side and call on those. And in fact, we have to lean more heavily on those other parts of our personality. And so when somebody has a context that has gotten them out of their dominant driver or co-pilot auxiliary a lot, sometimes that can make it more difficult to come up with an accurate assessment because the person is not so polarized on one side or the other. There's a little bit more balance. So if your professional life has required you to develop the other part of this thinking or feeling preference, meaning that your driver or dominant is going to be definitively one of those, but the other one is going to be either extroverted thinking or effectiveness if you're an INFP, or extroverted feeling or harmony if you're an INTP. And if your work context has required that of you, then that might make it a little bit more difficult to determine which one is your dominant because you're forced to use the other side so much more often.
I would argue that most work contexts require you to develop one of those two you just mentioned, Antonia. Either extroverted feeling or harmony to play nice with others and be open to interoperability with other people. And then the other one is extroverted thinking or effectiveness, the ability to get things done and accomplish tasks and stay on projects. So in a work environment, both of those are typically what people are trained to demonstrate or show up with. So I think that's fundamentally also why either an INFP or INTP, it can be challenging because that inferior or 3-year-old process is going to be, no matter which type you are of those two, that 3-year-old process is going to be rewarded by the career environment you're in, most likely.
Yeah, there's a requirement, and this of course is the perpetual complaint of IPs everywhere, right? Is that every work or career context I enter requires me to be, or at least integrate my 3-year-old or inferior function. And so in some ways it's a frustration, but in other ways it's actually serving the IP. That said, in a professional context, should you answer based on professional or personal? I would say definitely personal. When you're going through an online assessment or really any typology assessment, you're going to want to answer what is your tendency, what is the thing that is your preference, and because that's what you're ultimately looking for. You're looking for your cognitive preferences. You're not trying to nail in who you are. You're trying to determine, all other things being equal, which direction am I going to go? And if a professional context is forcing you out of what would be your natural tendency, then the professional context is not an accurate representation of you. It might be a good representation of how you've grown. It might show a lot of angles about who you've become because you can't be one-sided and you had to stretch outside your comfort zone. It will give you all sorts of great information on that. But at the end of the day, it's not going to tell you what your natural pre-wiring what direction it wants you to go. So I would definitely answer in a more personal preference way as opposed to a business context. Now, I do also want to speak to the specific style question that you mentioned, which is, do I speak my mind on things that I strongly disagree with? Which seems to be, I'm assuming that question is trying to determine thinking versus feeling, in the sense that if you speak on things that you strongly disagree with, you're a thinker. And if you withhold that, then you're more likely to be a feeler. And I don't know if I would say that question is a great one for thinking feeling. particularly because this tends to be a personality trait, I would argue, of all the IP types. All IP types have a tendency to get struck when things don't resonate with them. This includes IFPs and ITPs. In fact, in some ways, I would say IFPs are more likely to speak on things that strike their convictions wrong than ITPs, who might have a tendency to not want to rock the boat because now they're in the middle of a messy relationship situation. Now, on the other side of the coin, an ITP, when they don't think that they're entering relationship challenge waters, right? Like it's not going to actually turn into a fight necessarily, they'll speak very strongly about their opinions on things. And almost always they're surprised when somebody takes offense. It's an ITP's inability to read the room, right? And just speak on things that they feel strongly about, not assuming that there's going to be any sort of conflict. And then being surprised and then going, oh yeah, that's right. When I speak up, I get conflict. Duh, right? That's like something that always ends up happening sort of in post. Or they've been trained that way so much that they just withhold their opinions all the time. That is not uncommon for ITP types to have gotten punished throughout their life for speaking up and then just going, okay, I'm just not going to say anything unless I super trust this person. Whereas IFP types might have actually been rewarded for having strong convictions and they might not have been shut down. And there's not as much of a problem with creating relational conflict when values are involved, personal values are involved for IFPs. So I wouldn't use those kinds of questions necessarily as a good determiner between thinking and feeling. That said, if you find yourself mostly trending towards feeling style answers, except in a professional context, I would say that you are more likely to be an INFP because all IFPs have to develop a lot of extroverted thinking or effectiveness in order to get things done in a work environment, usually, unless they're in the arts. But even then, any business is going to require you to develop or at least hold space and integrate that part of who you are. So based on the question that you used as an example, based on the professional piece sort of throwing off the results, I would trend more towards INFP and really look at those descriptions, particularly the cognitive functions, more than INTP necessarily. But of course, I don't know you, so of course I'm not going to diagnose this, from a single question. That would be silly. There is something to be said, though, as just a final little note on all of this. There is something to be said for not using behavior as the final arbiter of type. There's a lot of learned behaviors and a lot of behaviors that we've had to pick up just to survive that ends up throwing type analysis off. So diving into the cognitive functions and really maybe talking to somebody who's very well versed in this might be the best solution to all of this, because somebody who really maybe has been trained in all of it can get to what we call the side door method in profiler training. In profiler training, when we do interviews, we're always looking for things that people can't game. And we're looking for things that live underneath the behavior, like, talking about certain subjects and it lights a person up, or talking about other subjects and that person just kind of shrugs. It's no big deal. Those are the kinds of things that are a little bit more oriented towards the person's relationship to their cognition and to the rest of the world, other than learned behaviors. So I might go down that path for a little while and see if you can't find your best fit type and all of that.
Thanks, Carly, for the question. You can ask your own question about personality types or personal growth. Visit personalityhacker.com/questions. We also have programs designed to help you with your personal growth through the lens of personality types. Again, visit personalityhacker.com and find the program that's made just for you. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Type Advice by Personality Hacker. We'll talk with you on the next episode. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, Then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.